Hey, nice Atypical Daydream t-shirt.
Thanks. It's my favorite podcast.
Mine too. But where can I get a t-shirt?
It's easy. The link is in the show notes.
That is easy. I'm gonna go get one right now.
That's a great idea.
Thanks. Bye.
You bet. Stay cool.
To me, life just feels like one big road trip. So, but I've never actually done like this weird road trip or anything like that, So I was always that kid like who would probably drive it from the airport and like watch planes take off and like basically tell myself, yeah, I'm going to be on one of those.
Hello, my Atypical Daydreamers. Welcome to the show. My guest today is Karthik Nagarajan. Having recently relocated my family from the United States to Berlin, Germany, I've been drawn to stories of others who have chosen a similar path. Karthik shares his journey of self-realization as a young man in India and offers a unique perspective on building a new life in the United States. A life that feels like an endless road trip.
I always had a passion for like talking to people from an early age. And a lot of that, I think, just comes from my upbringing, because I grew up in the 90s, like in a small town in India. It's not so small anymore, called Pune. And like, you've got to understand that this is like the dawn of globalization in India. It's not like India was still very closed in the 80s. They were almost like apprehensive about like opening up in a big way because, of all the colonial past and all that stuff, right? So early 90s, right? Like I'm a kid sort of growing up in India, very sort of interesting childhood because I kind of grew up in a very normal, in many ways, middle-class family in my town, right? My dad had a 9-to-5 job. You had a 5.5-day work week, I think, back then. So you had to work half the day on Saturday. Like it's a very traditional sort of British model. So yeah, my family expected me to like grow up into something, right? Like do very well in academics and like become some sort of computer engineer that makes money and like, all the typical stuff. On the flip side of that, like I grew up 5 minutes from this ashram. So basically it was sort of like this commune that was full of Europeans and Americans. So there was this interesting sort of juxtaposition in my neighborhood between like just kids like me, and then kids whose parents took the complete opposite approach that my dad would take in life, right? Which is like, I don't care about 9 to 5. I just want to like travel and experience life. This ashram was actually covered in a Netflix documentary called Wild Wild Country. So it's this sort of Rajneesh ashram that like, so he came from Portland, Oregon to basically 5 minutes from where I grew up. So, and obviously like documentaries tend to like, you have to be colorful with what you're doing, right? But like for me, one of my best friends, and he's still my best friend today, lives now in Paris, France, but he was this French guy, Virgil. Like we just became friends when we were like 12 or 13 because we both liked playing Street Fighter on the Super Nintendo. It was not more complicated than that when it first started out. And we hit it off on day one and we became like friends for life. We still are. Basically everything my dad would tell me about how success is measured, right? Like, so all the traditional things, as you can imagine, get educated, go to a prestigious university, like be the top of your class, go get like some job that pays you a lot of money, right? And like, that's how you get to success. It's the exact opposite from like what my friends did, the approach he took to life, which is like, it's all about experience, right? And the 9 to 5, all that stuff is made up. So it was almost like, it was fascinating and I think it was very healthy. And I think back kind of on that environment in which I grew up. And I'm like, that environment was actually very healthy in retrospect. I didn't realize it growing up there. So my friend's dad, to set some context, like he's very much an artist, made music, art, like wrote books, things like that. Very creative and used to be a pretty successful banker in France. And just one day decided like, I'm done with this stuff. I'm just going to take a different route to life. And that's how he ended up at this ashram. And he never saw me as his son's friend. He just saw me as like Karthik. I have very fond memories with like both of them, growing up. And it was just a lot of discovery, curiosity, just listening to jazz and ambient music and smoking cigarettes and like proofreading his books and like helping translate them. MTV came to India in the 90s, right? Like early 90s. And the first memory of a music video I ever saw was U2, Even Better Than the Real Thing. And it's a very fascinating sort of video, even today, if you look at it. Like, it's so ironic because that whole video is basically making fun of like One World Under TV, right? They were going through that phase, the Action Babies, Europa phase, where you had these big screens at all their concerts, and Bono was playing The Fly, and like so. I think it was like very fascinating what was going on in India at the time, right? Like, and the kind of milieu I was growing up in. For some reason, like I discovered David Bowie, and I got like super into him. In addition to all the electronic stuff, and I was very sort of curious about my own sexuality and things like that. Like, I used to cross dress. And like, I was very inspired by his Ziggy Stardust phase. Because I just thought he was this very unique creature, like during that phase. And I had like this motorcycle and like, I had really long hair and I would wear makeup, like but not overtly, not to make a statement. It was my own sort of self-actualization in many ways. Because you didn't have social media and all that. You had to discover all these things on your own. Right. So it's not like somebody was telling you this is how you need to look or like this is how. It was all done in a somewhat original way, I'd say. I actually remember this time when I was at a red light, right, and just looking like how I would normally look in my typical sort of makeup and with my hair down and on my motorcycle and like just riding around town, and these two sort of really like some macho looking alpha male types pull up like next to me at the red light, and they look at me and they're like, "Hey baby, do you want to go grab a drink?" And like I look back at them in the same deep voice, and I'm like, "Yeah, sure. I know a bar 2 blocks down." And it's like they'd seen a ghost. They ran through the red light, and like I never saw them again. But there was no real internet, and there was no real all this LGBTQ stuff had still to hit, and it was done much more in like pockets. And it was very fringe at the time. And a lot of the TV and all that was still setting in, like global TV. When you're sort of like in this environment where, it's the dawn of a lot of things, you do things in like small measures. So it's almost like for a lot of people looking at me, they may just be like, "Oh, that's a go." But it's only when these interesting sort of social experiments happen, that you kind of, you realize life is charming in these like little doses, these one-on-one type doses. Anytime you take something and like you make it part of this large movement, some of the experimentation goes away, right? Because it's almost like this is the playbook, this is how. And maybe things happen within that structure, because there's always these like micro things. But I think when there's no macro thing, and a lot of these mini micro things are leading up to it somehow, and you're part of it at that point, can be quite fascinating.
Hey, it's Josh. Hope you're enjoying the podcast. And if so, are you wanting more road stories? Well, good news. I've got you covered. Consider becoming a patron. You'll have access to loads of great bonus stories that there just wasn't time for. And you'll be supporting a truly independent podcast. Find the link in the show notes. And thanks. Now back to the show.
To me, life just feels like one big road trip. So, but I've never actually done like this weird road trip or anything like that, So I was always that kid like who would probably drive it from the airport and like watch planes take off and like basically tell myself, yeah, I'm going to be on one of those. But I finally was able to I got to a point where my parents could provide for that. And I kind of, got an undergraduate degree and all that. And I finally kind of did. I had a couple of options. Like I could go to any, I could probably look to Europe. I could look to America. I could look to Australia, Canada, whatever. Right. But I was just influenced by a lot of the art that came out of here for me to go anywhere else. Big fan of a lot of the modern art that came, post World War II art. Right. And applies very broadly, to painting, to music, to TV, movies, all that stuff. So just like many immigrants that come here, I suspect I was pulled in through art and media in some ways, right? People have been coming here for decades, for almost a century due to some Humphrey Bogart movie they probably saw, right? The reality is different. This country is not a Hollywood movie, right? The first place I landed in the U.S. was Binghamton, New York, which is a small town in upstate New York, smaller than the town, way smaller than the town I ever grew up in, right? And I did 6 months at a university called SUNY Binghamton. So So yeah, I spent sort of my first 6 months in this country in Binghamton, New York, and it was a very fascinating place because I got there in January, which is the coldest period there. Right. And you're talking about somebody a kid who's never seen snow in his life. I don't know if my ears are going to make it through 1 week because they're turning red every day and I can't feel them anymore. And I was totally ill-equipped in so many ways. I didn't have that much money on me. I just early days, what I remember is there was this sort of university circle, right, in Binghamton. And as long as you were within that sort of perimeter, things seemed kind of normal. But in some neighborhoods these, I didn't really know what a rough neighborhood was. And there are many parts of upstate New York, when you get close to the Pennsylvania border, where you think of the Northeast as this very sort of diverse place, but you can get pretty sort of backwoods in those places. So, early days, I just remember I had to do a lot of manual work because I had to pay the rent, right? So I got a job washing dishes in the school cafeteria, and this is it's not like washing dishes at home or loading the dishwasher at home. It's these large commercial dishwashers, and it's like working in an assembly line basically, right? And these dishes come in, and you're supposed to it's very simple. You take this huge pile of dishes on a tray and you put it in to the dishwasher. I used to work with this one lady. She had been doing this, I could tell, for decades, right? She was just so good at it, and they put me on shift with her. So me, I'm new at this country. It's my first job. I'm sort of this eager beaver, right? And I don't want to let anybody down. And first 2-3 weeks, I would just go at it, all in. Right. And it was a numbers game to me. I would keep loading this dishwasher. And I think at the end of 3 weeks, I got burnt out. So week 4 or coming up on a month, I am really struggling one evening. Right. And this lady who I worked with, she was very much this quiet type. Right? She had not said one word to me in 3 weeks. She was an interesting character because I would take the bus back home with her. I think she had a longer route, but I would be sitting in my seat on the bus and she would be sitting opposite from me. She would just have this 1,000-mile stare. Month in, I am really struggling, right? I'm struggling to load this dishwasher. I'm just tired. And she notices that and she just leans over and in a soft voice, she says, just remember, the dishes will always keep coming. Right? And so that's the best advice I've ever gotten. It didn't lead to anything deeper between us. It's not she all of a sudden struck up a conversation or So, I went from this very, almost the Northeast, right? Yankee Central to kind of the South, but not quite the South, right? It's not Alabama. It's Texas. It's a little different. It was very fascinating sort of living in Texas. I moved there before moving to California because I often find just given how tech heavy this whole area is, especially in Northern California, a lot of like folks from India and places like that move directly here because, they're kind of like well equipped to do these types of jobs, right? They never get that other experience within the country. Like they don't see the Binghamtons and they don't see the Texases of the world. And so it's often like their worldview is very shaped by like what's going on here. And so I feel very grateful that, I don't know if it's the choices I made or just something guiding me this stuff, but like that I actually went to upstate New York and I then went to like Texas and then I ended up in San Francisco. Right. And I have some sense for like, what people call like flyover states and things like that. Unfortunately, like there's this whole country out there, which is like incredibly fascinating. I actually remember somebody else asking me when I was doing a little bit of back and forth between Houston and San Francisco for a while, just asking me like, how are the places different? Like, and are the people different or like, and I was like, yeah, it's fascinating. The places are different because the way you live your life is very different. Like in San Francisco, I don't really even drive the car anymore. And what people say to me feels different. Like obviously because like Texas is more broadly speaking Republican and like California or Northern California especially has this reputation for being like the other end of that, right? But I was like, but if I dig one level deeper, I actually find that people are not that different. In many ways, they're equally ignorant about each other. I remember some of the folks I hung out with, like when I was spending time in Houston, they were so different from like some of the folks I hang out here with, right? Like, and I'm sort of more involved in this tech startup community here. Like, so I do sales at a very early stage, like tech startup, and it's a certain type of scene. Like if you've been part of it, like you would understand. It's very like almost like I'm building something seminal, right? Like any entrepreneurial venture, and it's gonna like change the world in an incredible way. There is a certain amount of like hubris that goes with that. It's kind of like I am on Mars when other people are on Earth in some ways, or something like that, right? I don't think people here would completely understand, somebody who's very successful in their career in the oil and gas industry and has like a stag head outside their office and wears cowboy boots to work and probably understands the internet as well as anybody here, but might just judge people like that by their surface appearances.
I want to thank Karthik for sharing his experience. Do you know someone who would appreciate today's stories? Why not send them this episode? The support really helps. This podcast is created and produced by me, Josh Caldwell. Music by Visual Aid, my side music project. General support and copywriting by Miranda Caldwell. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come back next time.